For this lecture, we're going to be discussing the developments at Teotihuacan during the Classic period. And this will be important in part because we've been talking about the rise of these late formative and Classic period cities, but also when we talk about the collapse in Mesoamerica at the end of the Classic period, it appears as though Teotihuacan played a central role in that development. Teotihuacan reached its peak in the first half of the first millennium of the Common Era. So between about 1 CE and 500 CE, the site of Teotihuacan reached 22 square kilometers in size, with an estimated population ranging up to 200,000 people. And keep an eye on that number because as archaeologists learn more and more about basically the suburbs of this urban settlement, it appears that the population estimate keeps growing. And in general, this Basin of Mexico region, the Valley of Mexico, where modern Mexico City is located, had the densest occupation in Mesoamerica with about 500,000 people. Now, there were other sites in the Basin of Mexico, but the next largest sort of group of them only had a few thousand people. And so Teotihuacan, as this urban center with up to 200,000 people, was really exponentially larger than anything else around it. It was a real sort of central hub of not only Central Mexican population, but in general, it was one of the most important sites, if not the most important site in Mesoamerica in the basically during much of the Classic period, especially in the first half of the Classic period. Now, the dates for the eventual collapse of Teotihuacan are still debated. We're going to talk about that more later in the class. But pay attention to that because it appears as though the important site of Teotihuacan and its collapse actually played a role in the domino effect of collapse elsewhere in Mesoamerica. It was during the Classic period that the architecture that we know at Teotihuacan took on sort of its present form. Now, obviously, these buildings have been reconstructed to a degree by the Mexican government, but the Pyramid of the Moon, the Pyramid of the Sun, reached the proportions we see today, in fact, probably slightly larger. The Temple of Quetzalcoatl was completed and then was covered over by basically a layer of rubble. And the entire site and its organization, the downtown portion of the site, and its organization around the Street of the Dead came to take on its current proportions. But, as we mentioned, it appears as though from the outset, this site was carefully planned. The positioning of the Pyramid of the Sun, for example, carefully located over a cave, appears to have been something that was planned from the very beginning. Because Classic period occupations at Teotihuacan left their impression on the surface and basically covered up the late formative period stuff below it, we know most about the social organization at the site during that time period. So for example, especially in the real urban core of the city, many people, the commoners, lived in apartment compounds, not so different from some of the apartments that we live in today, from some apartments that I've lived in my life. There are 2,200 of these known apartments. They have multiple rooms, they have central patios and passageways, they have drains for their water, they have, in some cases, centrally located shrines. These apartments varied in size, some of them between 50 and 200 rooms, or between 2,000 and 4,000 square meters, housing anywhere between 50 and 100 people, probably in related family groups, and those groups would each have sort of like a central shrine that they would share. These are the lower status or sort of, kind of working class occupants of Teotihuacan. Here you can see a reconstruction of one of these apartment complexes, and just so you know, where you can see small pebbles pressed into the mortar between those rocks, that is a tradition that the Mexican government used for a while to show what they had reconstructed. They began with foundations that were still present, and they basically reconstructed some of the stones. Here's an example of one of the household temples with a small plaster staircase that would have been located within one of these apartment complexes. Here's another example of essentially a shared central patio with a shrine that would have been shared by a group of occupants of this larger apartment building. So by comparing these apartment complexes and other places in which people lived, we can get an idea what was the social hierarchy in place at the time. So here's an example of in the urban area where lower status people would have lived in pretty dense apartment conditions. So if we compare, for example, a lower status apartment compound that was located relatively near to the Sun Pyramid and had nearly 200 rooms, we can see that a lot of people would have been living in a pretty densely occupied apartment setting. Now we can compare that to some other compounds where higher status people lived, such as the Teotihuaca compound and the Quetzalpopolotl compound, where you have higher status individuals living with more space, closer to the real downtown core of the site, and having some amenities such as painted murals, complex stonework, and a real downtown location. So just like today, if you wanted to live downtown right where all the action is, you might pay a higher price for your housing. So here's an example of a higher status compound. It may be a little bit difficult to see here, but these people had more room, more living space, nicer shared apartment complex, patios, and in particular they had things like beautifully painted murals. So you can see here an example of a mural with a lot of different iconographic elements going on, including a couple of basically Quetzalcoatl feathered serpent sort of motifs framing this doorway. Here you can see another partial mural where a jaguar or a mountain lion, some kind of big cat, is playing a shelled trumpet. Notice also that this cat is wearing some headgear, sort of like a feathered headdress. So clearly this isn't just any cat. This is probably something kind of similar to what we saw for the Olmec, where a ruler is depicted as having the ability to transform into a cat identity. Also note the presence of what look like feather headdresses and then some things that kind of look like a starfish or something above that lion or jaguar. This is, now there isn't traditionally writing recognized for Teotihuacan, but some of these glyphs are getting rather similar to writing. Here we have a remnant of a wall mural that was really an elaborate one, and it's unfortunate that it's missing. We can see at the bottom portion probably a bird was in this mural wearing some kind of complex headdress. So again, these murals are demonstrating a widespread Mesoamerican belief where human identity and animal identity are not very dichotomous. There's a blending between the two, and human rulers or powerful people, shamans, ritual practitioners, may be depicted as having an ability to transform. Here's a more complete example of a powerful bird, maybe a bird of prey. I'm not sure if that's an eagle or an owl. It depends on the style of the art here, but another powerful bird being depicted in a wall mural at one of these higher status Teotihuacan residences. Here at the Quetzalpopolotl Palace, we can see that the INA, the Mexican government, has spent a lot of time to reconstruct this palace. Now, when they reconstruct something, they don't just make it up out of their imaginations. They take the stones that were found at that site, and they spend a lot of time with expert craftspeople and architects and so forth to work on how this building would have been built when it was complete. They replace things like wooden beams that have been lost over the centuries and so forth. They reconstruct painted murals. And so they haven't done this with all of the palaces at Teotihuacan, but with the Quetzalpopolotl Palace, they've done a good job to reconstruct it as an example so that tourists to the site can see how the wealthier occupants of downtown Teotihuacan would have lived at the classic period peak of the site. As you can see on this picture that I've taken from maybe partway up, or maybe I'm at the top, on the Pyramid of the Sun, I've shown you where the Quetzalcoatl Palace is located, and it's really close to downtown. It's basically just off the Avenue of the Dead, close to the Pyramid of the Moon. The people who lived there were clearly important members of the kind of ruling elite at Teotihuacan. And how was all of this afforded in an economic sense? How did Teotihuacan become so influential, not only in the basin of Mexico, but all over Mesoamerica? Teotihuacan became a very important trade center and perhaps even a military conquest site that at some point went out to conquer other regions, such as sites in the Maya region. Well, one argument for how that's been done is that the occupants of Teotihuacan, actually before the city and even after the city, took advantage of a nearby volcanic source of naturally occurring volcanic glass known as obsidian. In particular, the Pachuca obsidian source. As I joked earlier in the class, it's not just a good Mexican soccer team, it's also this really famous, well-known source of obsidian, in part because it's high-quality glass material. It doesn't have a lot of inclusions. It fractures very predictably. It makes a great tool, but it's also green, and that's really important in Mesoamerica. The color green is a sacred color. It represents sort of nobility. It represents freshness. It represents even sort of good breath of the elite class. It can represent agricultural fertility, and by analogy, human fertility. So really, for Mesoamericans, things that were green stones like jadeite, green obsidian like the Pachuca green obsidian source, those things were the real treasures of Mesoamerica. So for example, when the Spanish showed up later looking for gold, the Maya and the Aztecs didn't really quite understand, because to them, gold was great, but jadeite and other green materials were more valuable. So essentially, Teotihuacan in central Mexico became an exporter of Pachuca green obsidian. They had so much of it that they exported it all over Mesoamerica, beginning right at the end of the formative and into the classic period, and essentially used that to accumulate a lot of wealth, a lot of power and influence over Mesoamerica. So this zoomed-in area of the map here actually shows the southern Mexican state of Oaxaca, where I do my research, in the lower Rio Verde Valley at the bottom there. But even in Oaxaca, which is hundreds of kilometers away from the basin of Mexico, we can see when Teotihuacan became a powerful site at the very end of the formative and into the early classic, because green obsidian and a few other things show up in the archaeological record, even in these distant sites, and demonstrate the export power, the wealth of Teotihuacan. Some of those other artifacts that show up include Teotihuacan-specific ceramics. So here you have a couple of examples of diagnostic pottery with an orangish slip, or diagnostic pottery with sort of a Tlaloc goggle-wearing rain god character depicted. And when pottery like this shows up in different parts of Mesoamerica, just like with the Pachuca green obsidian, it's easy to identify the era during which Teotihuacan had its greatest influence. So, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, there were districts of Teotihuacan where different ethnic groups from around Mesoamerica, including Zapotecs from Oaxaca, descendants of the Olmecs from the Gulf region, and as I'll discuss at the end of this lecture, possibly even a group of Maya nobility, lived in different neighborhoods of Teotihuacan, and that's one of the things I think is really fascinating about it. In that sense, it was a cosmopolitan city, just like a city we have today. Like if you walked through LA, depending on what neighborhood you were in, you'd hear different languages, you'd smell different ethnic foods, you'd see different styles of architecture. That appears to be the case for Teotihuacan, and I think that's really fascinating. And as we just discussed with the specialized pottery of Teotihuacan and these different ethnic enclaves, as well as the lithic production of Pachuca green obsidian artifacts, especially specialized things such as prismatic blades, there were a lot of craft specialists working at Teotihuacan, and that was perhaps one reason why people from all over Mesoamerica moved there, is that it was sort of this hub for craft specialization. But like other cities in the ancient world, the majority of the population was probably still farmers. So we have spent much of the lectures on Teotihuacan discussing the downtown, discussing the major architectural features of the downtown, built out of stone, things like the Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon, and so forth, and the Avenue of the Dead, sort of organizing all of this. And you can see that at the center of this plan view map. But it's worth keeping in mind, all of this would have been surrounded by suburbs where commoner farmers lived in, with potentially dirt floors and grass roofs and so forth, just like in other parts of Mesoamerica. And we just don't have as much of that to show you because it hasn't been reconstructed. It's more ephemeral structures. In some cases, there's even modern towns that have been built on parts of this. And as I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion of Teotihuacan, there's even a spot in the sort of northeastern part of the map here where a modern Walmart has been built and actually covers part of the site of Teotihuacan. Despite decades of excavation and study at Teotihuacan, as I mentioned, last time I was there were ongoing excavations still. Despite all of this research and reconstruction, there are still some great mysteries about Teotihuacan. I mean, one of the biggest is we don't actually know who built the site. We have a general idea that they were probably speakers of some Uto-Aztecan language, perhaps who had migrated into central Mexico from the north in sort of a wave that will actually predict the later migrations of the Mexica people who become the Aztecs. But by the time the Aztecs came to the site of Teotihuacan, the site had been abandoned for centuries, and the Aztecs thought it was built by the gods. So the names we have for these features come to us from the Aztecs. There aren't a lot of artistic depictions of rulers at Teotihuacan, as we saw with the apartments versus the palaces. There was clearly social differentiation, and somebody had to be planning all of this. This is a planned, organized community. So clearly somebody was in charge, but we don't know who they were. They don't brag about themselves very much. And the religion of Teotihuacan is also very enigmatic. So there are connections in the religion of Teotihuacan to other parts of Mesoamerica, but there are also some things that appear to be kind of unique about religion at Teotihuacan. And one of those unique things is a deity who's been called the Great Goddess. And the Great Goddess, you can see here in this depiction, there's a face in the lower portion of this image wearing a large butterfly nose plug. That's kind of her iconic thing, and she's got the big ear spools off to the side. In fact, her face may well be a mask. That's important to remember. It may be that we're looking at a mask in the nose plug. And then a huge feather headdress appears to be all part of the iconography of this great goddess. In this partially reconstructed mural, you can see the great goddess in more detail. So the face of the great goddess is actually kind of in the middle, with those two diamond eyes and a big nose plug again, a big butterfly-shaped nose plug and the two ear spools off to the side. And then above that face is the bird face that appears to be part of the headdress. You've got this huge, elaborate, feathered headdress that in some ways is actually bigger than the person. And then you've got the person down below, and from her hands is issuing probably raindrops or maybe raindrops and seeds, kind of like markers of fertility. She is the tree that's above her. She is fertility. She gives fertility to the land. And in some ways, the iconography of the great goddess sort of combines masculine and feminine elements, and you can see on the framing her on the right and left some priests probably who are speaking perhaps, but also depositing seeds. Maybe they're planting seeds, and then the great goddess is bringing rain. So in that sense, she may be related to a rain goddess phenomenon, although, as we mentioned, Tlaloc is the Mesoamerican rain god celebrated here. So the great goddess is kind of a mystery. Here's a carving of the great goddess that I believe is located at the National Museum in Mexico City. And behind this carving, you can see a reconstruction of some of these elite palaces from downtown Teotihuacan. On this carving itself, notice the really kind of blocky, regimented, simplistic, in a sense, artistic style, showing this huge figure, probably wearing a mask with these massive ear spools. And then she's got her two hands out, and from her hands issue those flowing raindrops again. And then there's something fitted in the center, in the chest. There's a hole that maybe indicates this piece is so large and blocky because it was actually a pillar, maybe to support a roof. And so perhaps there's a wooden beam that's supposed to fit into the chest. We don't know. So this is a huge piece of Teotihuacan art that I believe was actually discovered at Tenochtitlan, the city of the Aztecs. So maybe that the Aztecs brought this back. This is another one of my favorite artifacts from anywhere in Mesoamerica. This is a greenstone mask that was probably found at Teotihuacan by the Aztecs and then brought to the Aztec capital city of Tenochtitlan, where it was later rediscovered by archaeologists. Now this mask looks similar to me to the masks that are depicted on the Great Goddess. So this may be a mask worn by a Great Goddess statue. It's beautifully made. Look at the soft cheeks. I mean, they appear to be soft, and this is carved out of really dense greenstone. Look at the teeth made out of coral. Look at the massive ear spools that have been carved out of a different kind of greenstone. Notice how her eyes are a piece of shell with a small disc of Pachuca green obsidian laid over it to make the pupil. This is a beautiful, kind of haunting artifact. I think actually, if you look closely, there's some plaster or some kind of pigment that was originally on this mask. And if you also look closely around the edges, this mask is covered with holes, indicating it was actually tied on to a statue or a person or something. So this mask was clearly part of a bigger piece of attire or a bigger piece of maybe even architecture. It's the size of a human face, but imagine this thing with perhaps human hair around it, perhaps on a statue that was wearing clothing. I mean, it's possible that this thing would have almost appeared alive when it was in use. Some of the other religious art from Teotihuacan fits better with the rest of Mesoamerica, whereas the Great Goddess is kind of unique to Teotihuacan. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, features heavily in the religion not only of Teotihuacan, obviously at the Temple of Quetzalcoatl, but also elsewhere in the stories of Mesoamerica. The Teotihuacan rain deity, Tlaloc. There are versions of this rain deity or storm god or lightning god all over Mesoamerica. The Zapotecs had Cosijo, the Maya had Choc, the later Aztecs had paid some reverence to Tlaloc. So this is one of these pan-Mesoamerican gods. And then discoveries at Teotihuacan are very much ongoing. Saburo Sugiyama is one of the well-known archaeologists who continues to do research at Teotihuacan. And Dr. Sugiyama is really interested in the idea that the buildings at Teotihuacan are very carefully laid out. They're pointed toward astronomical features. He has recently had some excavations that exposed evidence of maybe a Maya enclave at Teotihuacan that was at some point destroyed. That may suggest some kind of internal strife, maybe to do with the eventual conquest of part of the Maya region by Teotihuacan prior to the collapse of Teotihuacan. So the research is very much ongoing. There's a lot of exciting stuff for us to learn. And make sure you check out the links to other content, videos, and articles and so forth in the weekly module.